Welcome back, everybody, to part two of our Modern Indian History deep dive.
Yeah.
Tailor-made for our UPSC aspirants and history enthusiasts out there. Especially for those of you in school or college. Don't forget to hit subscribe and give us a like if you're finding this valuable. Today we're going to be rewinding the clock a little bit to explore a really fascinating chapter of colonial India, the Dutch East India Company. Now, they may not have stuck around as long as, say, the British or the Portuguese, but their story is packed with spice, rivalry, and a few surprises along the way.
It's so interesting to think about the Dutch arrival in India. It coincided with this time when Europe was just crazy for spices, and everyone was racing to control those super valuable Eastern trade routes.
And as a UPSC aspirant, you're probably already well-versed in the different forces that shaped modern India. But the Dutch East India Company often gets kind of overshadowed by the British right. So we're going to uncover why their story is so important for acing that exam. So picture this. The year is 1596. Cornelis de Houtman becomes the very first Dutchman to reach Sumatra and Bantam, and that kind of marks the beginning of Dutch interest in the region.
Exactly. They saw potential in India, and of course all those spices were a huge draw.
I mean, who can resist spices, right?
Yeah.
But with all those spices comes competition. So how did the Dutch establish themselves in a region that was already dominated by powerful empires like the Mughals?
Well, that's where the story gets really interesting. In 1602, they formed the Dutch East India Company, or VOC for short.
The VOC. Now that name rings a bell. But tell me more. What made them so unique?
The VOC wasn't just some regular trading company. They had their own army, they could negotiate treaties, they even built forts.
Hold on a second. If they had their own army and were making treaties, were they basically like a mini-state operating within India? How did the Mughals react to that?
That's a great question, and it speaks to how unique the VOC was. They were this fascinating blend of commercial and state power, kind of like a very early version of a modern corporation with global reach. The Mughals at that time were actually dealing with a lot of internal issues, and they saw the VOC as a source of trade and revenue, more than a direct threat, at least initially. This allowed the Dutch to gain a foothold pretty quickly. They set up their first trading post in India at Masulipatam in 1605, modern-day Machilipatnam.
Masulipatam. Okay, so they established their first foothold. But they weren't content to just stay put in one place, were they?
No, definitely not. From Masulipatam, they spread out like an octopus. Their network expanded across the Indian subcontinent. Surat, Bengal, Ceylon, key spots on the Malabar coast. They were everywhere.
Wow, talk about ambitious.
Yeah.
But it couldn't have just been spices driving all this expansion. What else were they trading?
You're right. Their trade was incredibly diverse. Think cotton, indigo, silk, rice, even opium. You name it, they traded it.
Opium. Now, that's a trade with a whole other story behind it, for sure. But with this rapid expansion, did they ever bump heads with other European powers vying for control?
Oh, absolutely. The arrival of the English East India Company set the stage for what you could call a clash of titans.
The English? Now, that's a rivalry for the history books.
It really is. Both the Dutch and the English were major powers, hungry for dominance, and that led to some serious friction. They competed fiercely for the spice trade in the East Indies, and they even fought a series of brutal naval wars.
Wait, hold on. You're talking about the Anglo-Dutch Wars, right? Those were some of the most intense naval battles in history.
Exactly. Those wars weren't just about ships and cannons. They were about global dominance, control of trade routes, and ultimately shaping the future of empires. And these wars had ripple effects all over the world.
So these were huge conflicts with long-lasting consequences. Now, I'm curious about something. We've talked about the Dutch clashing with the English, but what about their relationships with the Indian kingdoms? Did they primarily focus on trade, or did they try to exert political control as well?
That's a really important question, and it's something that historians still debate today. It's clear that their main focus was on commerce, but they did dabble in diplomacy and formed alliances when it benefited their trading interests.
But sometimes those alliances could be pretty fragile, right? Especially when tensions were high, like in the Amboyna incident of 1623.
Oh, the Amboyna incident. Now, that was a dark chapter. The Dutch accused English and Japanese traders of plotting against them, and the executions that followed really escalated tensions between the two nations.
That's a pretty stark reminder of just how high the stakes were in this game of global trade, and how ruthless these companies could be in protecting their interests. Now, it wasn't just European powers that the Dutch had to contend with. They also had to navigate the complex political landscape of India itself. And sometimes those encounters led to some surprising outcomes, like the Battle of Colachel in 1741.
The Battle of Colachel is a really interesting case. It was a stunning victory for the Kingdom of Travancore against the Dutch forces. It showed that Indian kingdoms weren't just passive bystanders in the face of European expansion. They were active players, capable of resisting and even defeating these powerful forces.
Imagine that, an Indian kingdom taking down a European power. That must have sent shockwaves through the region. But despite this victory for Travancore, the Dutch were already on a path of decline in India, weren't they?
Yes. Unfortunately, that victory didn't change the course of history for the Dutch in India. Their influence was already waning, and there were several factors at play. Yeah, you could say their downfall really boils down to three main things. Constant conflict with the English just drained their resources. They shifted their focus to Indonesia, saw more profit potential there. And then there's the Agreement of 1667, which essentially nudged them out of India. It was like a slow, strategic retreat.
It's interesting how focusing on short-term gains can sometimes backfire in the long run. They prioritized Indonesia and ended up having to withdraw from India. But did they really vanish without a trace? What happened to all their trading posts, their infrastructure?
That's a great question. And it brings us to a really important point for anyone studying colonial history. The Dutch may have left, but their impact on India was far from insignificant. We can still see their influence in different parts of Indian life, from architecture to agriculture.
Now that you mention it, their architectural style is pretty noticeable in places like Kochi and Surat, right? I remember seeing some stunning examples of Indo-Dutch architecture during my travels. Those Dutch gables are hard to miss.
Absolutely. Those gables are a prime example of how they blended their architectural style with local traditions, creating this unique hybrid form. And it's not just architecture. We see their influence in language, even cuisine. Some words in Indian languages actually have Dutch roots, and there are dishes that clearly show that culinary exchange happened during that period.
It's fascinating how these historical events, even ones that seem distant or irrelevant, continue to shape our present. For our listeners preparing for the UPSC, it's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the bigger picture, the hows and whys of history.
Exactly. It's about developing those critical thinking skills, being able to analyze different perspectives and connect the dots between seemingly unrelated events. Studying the Dutch East India Company offers some valuable insights into the broader context of modern Indian history. We can compare and contrast different colonial approaches, understand the economic and political forces at play, and analyze the impact of these global events on the Indian subcontinent.
For example, think about their focus on trade. It wasn't just about extracting resources. They actively engaged with local markets, built complex trading networks, even introduced new crops and technologies that had a profound impact on the Indian economy, both positive and negative.
And we can't overlook the cultural exchanges that happened. These interactions, even though they're often overshadowed by the later British influence, they offer a nuanced understanding of how different cultures interacted and influenced each other.
All right, so let's take a step back and think about this from a UPSC aspirant's perspective. What are some of the key takeaways, the must-know points about the Dutch East India Company in India?
Well, first and foremost, understanding the timeline is crucial. When did they arrive? Where did they establish their trading posts? What were the key events that shaped their presence? Knowing those things is essential.
So dates like 1596, when Cornelis de Helpman first landed in Sumatra and Bantam, or 1602, the year the VOC was formed. Those are important milestones.
Exactly. And don't forget 1605, the year they set up their first trading post in India at Masulipatam.
Got it. Next, I'd say understanding the VOC's unique structure and powers is crucial. They weren't just a trading company. They had this quasi-governmental authority that gave them serious influence. They were almost like a state within a state.
You could say that their ability to wage war, negotiate treaties, establish fortified settlements. That set them apart from other trading companies.
And, of course, the Anglo-Dutch rivalry is a major theme. Understanding the causes, the key conflicts, the final outcome. It's crucial for grasping the bigger picture of colonial India.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, this rivalry wasn't confined to India. It played out on a global scale. Naval battles, territorial disputes, economic competition across continents. It was a clash of empires.
And last but not least, we have the Battle of Colachel, that rare instance of an Indian kingdom decisively defeating a European power. It's a really important example for understanding the complex dynamics of power during this era.
It reminds us that Indian kingdoms weren't just passive bystanders in the face of European colonialism. They were active players shaping the narrative in ways that we often overlook.
Wow, so much to unpack, so much to learn. It's clear that the Dutch East India Company, even though they were a relatively short chapter in Indian history, they played a significant role in shaping the events that followed. Their legacy in India might be subtle at times, but it's definitely there.
Absolutely. And that's why studying this period, understanding the nuances, the different perspectives, the long-lasting impacts, it's valuable not just for UPSC aspirants, but for anyone who's fascinated by the complex and captivating story of India's past.
You know, it really makes you think, what if things had gone differently?
Right.
What if the Dutch had actually managed to hold on and become the dominant power in India instead of the British? Would we see a different India today?
That's a question that could spark endless debates among historians. It's impossible to know for sure, but it's certainly a fascinating thought experiment.
Right, like a historical what-if scenario.
Exactly. Imagine a world where the Dutch, not the British, became the major force in India. Would their colonial system have been different? Would they have formed different alliances? How would that have affected India's independence movement? Who knows? It's really intriguing to think about.
It is. It highlights just how pivotal even seemingly small events can be in shaping the course of history. But going back to the Dutch East India Company, even though they ultimately declined, they still played a significant role in shaping events, right?
Absolutely. Their actions, even though they didn't achieve lasting dominance, still had ripple effects that we can feel even today, centuries later.
That's why it's so important to study those seemingly less prominent players in history. Right? Their decisions and their actions can have far-reaching consequences.
Couldn't agree more.
So for our listeners, especially those gearing up for the UPSC exams, what are some of the key takeaways from this deep dive into the Dutch East India Company in India?
Well, it's a story of ambition, of conflict, and ultimately of adaptation. They came to India seeking spices, they built this massive trading network, they even clashed with the powerful English, but their focus on trade, sometimes at the expense of building strong political alliances that, coupled with the allure of Indonesia's riches, led to their eventual withdrawal from India.
It's a story full of twists and turns and important lessons for anyone studying colonial history.
Definitely. And even though they left India, their legacy is still visible today in their architectural influences, the introduction of crops like coffee, and the subtle imprint of their culture on Indian society.
It's a reminder that history is more than just dates and names. It's about delving deeper into the complexities, understanding the cause and effect, and appreciating how everything is interconnected.
Exactly. And it's also about learning from the past to understand our present, and maybe even to glimpse into the possibilities of the future.
Well said. So to wrap things up, we encourage everyone to keep exploring this fascinating period in Indian history. Maybe delve into the lives of specific Dutch individuals who made their mark on India, or compare and contrast the colonial strategies of the Dutch and the British. There's so much out there waiting to be discovered.
And remember, history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a lens through which we can better understand ourselves and the world around us.
That's a great way to put it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the Dutch East India Company in India. We'll be back soon with another exciting episode exploring a new corner of history. Until then, keep those history books open and those minds curious.